Let me conclude with a discovery that comes from my own lab concerning electrocyclic ring opening reactions. In particular, we wondered whether or not we could alter the course of these reactions with an external force. We know that the normal pathway that's followed for cyclobutene ring opening is the con-rotatory pathway, and so the trans isomer should produce the EE diene. Similarly, the cis isomer, by con-rotatory ring opening, should produce the EZ diene. What my group wondered is whether or not we could use external force to alter the course of these reactions. So, for example, you could imagine if we could stretch the substituents by pulling them apart. In the case of the trans product, we might be able to use force to accelerate this reaction, because this stretching motion will end up promoting the con-rotatory pathway that's the allowed pathway for the cyclobutenes. But in contrast, what would happen if we stretched the cis isomer? If we stretch the cis isomer, the motion that we expect upon trying to pull those substituents apart would promote the disrotatory pathway. That's the disallowed pathway for the cyclobutenes. If, in the case of cyclobutenes, cis isomer, upon application of force, we observed the EE product, that would be evidence that our force opened up a forbidden pathway. That's exactly what we observed, both the accelerating effect as well as this altered course of reaction in the case of the cis isomer. The experiments that we did are shown here. As our cyclobutene, we took benzocyclobutene. If you draw the other resonance contributor of the benzene ring, there'll be a pi bond here, and this cyclobutene follows the normal course of electrocyclic reactions for cyclobutenes. Attached to these oxygen atoms were long-chain polymer molecules, which we could pull on and apply a force directly to this molecule. What we observed is that upon application of force, the electrocyclic ring opening reaction took place much faster and at a much lower temperature than was normally observed. We also observed that the stereochemistry of the product did not depend on whether or not we started with the cis or the trans isomer. Both the cis and the trans isomer produced the EE diene that's shown here. That's consistent with the idea that the trans isomer followed the con-rotatory pathway and the cis isomer followed the disrotatory pathway. The way we proved that was to trap this intermediate with a 4+2 cycloaddition reaction. Now we know that 4+2 reactions undergo their chemistry with stereospecificity, and so the diene geometry is going to be reflected in the stereochemistry of the product at these two positions. And that way we proved that both the cis and the trans isomer of our cyclobutene generated the EE intermediate. And so we can add to what's been known about the electrocyclic ring opening reactions. The con-rotatory reaction is the thermally allowed reaction pathway, as we've been discussing in these webcasts. The photochemically allowed pathway is a disrotatory pathway, and the cis and the trans isomer both follow the disrotatory pathway upon photolysis. And now what we learned is that upon application of force, we can bias the reaction pathway with this external mechanical energy source that we're bringing to bear on this molecule. And so the cis isomer follows the disrotatory pathway, while the trans isomer goes by the normal thermally allowed con-rotatory pathway. What's really significant is that after we published this work in 2007, we learned that we could take this one step further and use force to generate a color by the 6-pi electrocyclic ring opening reaction that's described here. What we did is attach this molecule to the center of a polymer chain. This is a spiropyran. We call it a mechanophore, meaning a mechanically sensitive unit. This bond, the carbon-oxygen bond, undergoes bond scission on a 6-pi electrocyclic ring opening reaction to generate this highly colored form, a merocyanine. One of the resonance contributors that's shown here is the 6-pi electrocyclic ring opening product. So by attaching a polymer molecule to the two sides of this and pulling on it, what we could do is promote that 6-pi electrocyclic ring opening reaction to take a colorless molecule and make it into a colored molecule. And so when we embedded our mechanophore into a polymer chain, and then put that polymer into a piece of plastic and stretched on it, regions where the force was greatest, that would be these regions that are very thin, we observed a very intense color change. And you can see the actual samples over here. This is a control in which we've attached not the polymer molecule not to this end, but we attached the polymer here and here. And so the polymer molecule didn't pass through this carbon-oxygen bond that breaks during the electrocyclic reaction. That control molecule showed that just the presence of the mechanophore isn't enough. It has to be properly linked so that the force can be passed through that carbon-oxygen bond. And now we have a mechanosensitive unit that will tell us if there has been force applied to these polymer molecules. I hope you can see from these examples that there's some very interesting chemistry that one can do in designing materials with these electrocyclic ring opening reactions.